Hello! We are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are discussing something that will change the way you learn English forever. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through a routine that makes fluency not just a goal, but a natural part of your day.
And I'm Abel. I am so glad to be here with you, Anna. Like many of our listeners, I used to struggle with finding time to study English. Today, we want to talk about how to stop cramming and start living your English through a morning routine.
That is such a perfect way to describe it, Abel. And I think the word cramming is really important here. So many learners feel like studying English means sitting at a desk for 2 or 3 hours with a textbook, a notebook, and maybe a very strong cup of coffee. They feel like if they do not have a long, dedicated study session, they are failing. But that belief is actually one of the biggest barriers to progress.
I completely relate to that. I used to think that if I could not study for at least 1 hour, it wasn't even worth trying. So some days I just did nothing at all, and then I felt guilty, which made me want to study even less.
That cycle is so common, Abel, and I'm really glad you're being honest about it. What we want to introduce today is a completely different philosophy. Instead of treating English as a subject you study, we want to help you treat it as a language you live. And the best place to start living your English is in the first moments of your morning.
So tell me more about that. Why is the morning so special? I know some people aren't morning people, so I want to understand why this particular time of day matters so much.
Great question. Let's talk about something called brain plasticity. Plasticity is the brain's ability to form new connections, to learn new patterns, and to absorb new information. Scientists and researchers have found that the brain is in a particularly receptive state in the first 1 to 2 hours after waking up. Some people call this the golden hour. During this time, your mind is transitioning from a sleep state to a fully alert state, and it's moving through something called the theta wave phase. Theta waves are associated with creativity, memory consolidation, and openness to learning.
That is fascinating. So what you're saying is that my brain is literally more prepared to absorb language in the morning than at other times of the day?
Exactly. Think about it this way. When you sleep, your brain does not simply switch off. It's actually very busy organizing everything you experienced during the previous day. It's sorting memories, making connections between new and old information, and essentially preparing a clean, organized space for the next day. When you wake up, that space is fresh. It's like a whiteboard that has just been cleaned. And if you immediately fill that whiteboard with high-quality English input, the language sticks much more effectively than it would in the afternoon when your mind is already full of the noise of the day.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we should be protecting that morning time and using it carefully. But I have a confession. The very first thing I used to do every single morning was pick up my phone and start scrolling through social media. Is that a problem?
Abel, I am so glad you brought that up because this is the first and perhaps most important rule in our morning English routine. We call it the no phone rule. And I want to be clear, this is not just about English learning. This is about protecting your mental state for the entire day. When you pick up your phone first thing in the morning and start scrolling, you're immediately exposing your freshly organized brain to a chaotic stream of information. You see news, arguments, advertisements, videos, messages, notifications, all in your native language, all demanding your emotional and mental attention.
And I never really thought about the language aspect of it before. When I scroll through social media in my native language, I'm basically activating my first language in my brain before I've had a chance to think in English.
Precisely. Language researchers talk about something called language activation. When you expose yourself to a language, your brain activates the entire network associated with it. Your vocabulary, your grammar, your emotional responses, your cultural associations, they all light up. If you activate your native language first thing in the morning, it becomes the dominant system in your mind. And then when you try to switch to English, you're essentially fighting against a strong current.
So the no phone rule is really about giving English the first position in your brain's morning activation. That's a completely new way of thinking about it for me.
Exactly. And practically speaking, the no phone rule is simple. When your alarm goes off, don't touch your phone for social media or news for at least the first 30 minutes of your day. You can use it to play English audio, which we'll talk about in a moment, but no scrolling, no checking messages, no reading news in your native language. Just give your brain those first 30 minutes in English, and you'll be amazed at how much lighter and more focused you feel.
I actually tried this for a week after someone recommended it to me, and I noticed that I felt less anxious in the mornings. I didn't realize how much emotional weight I was carrying from reading news the moment I woke up.
That's such an important observation, and it connects to something deeper about the psychology of language learning. When you're anxious or emotionally overwhelmed, your brain enters a defensive state. It prioritizes survival processing over learning. Stress actually reduces the brain's ability to form new connections. So by eliminating that first thing in the morning anxiety, you're not just improving your mood, you're physiologically improving your capacity to learn English.
So the no phone rule is step one. What comes next in the routine?
Step 2 is what I love to call passive input, and this is where things get really exciting for learners who feel like they never have enough time. Passive input means exposing yourself to English without actively studying it. You're simply listening while you do other things. Think about your morning routine. You wake up, you go to the bathroom, you brush your teeth, you wash your face, you make coffee or tea, you get dressed. All of that might take between 20 and 40 minutes. For most people, that time is completely silent, or they're listening to music, or they're thinking about what they need to do that day.
Which is essentially wasted time from a language learning perspective.
Not wasted, but definitely underused. And here's the beautiful thing. You don't need to do anything differently with those activities. You just need to change what's playing in the background. Instead of silence or music, you play English. A podcast, an audiobook, a YouTube video with clear speakers, a language learning channel. And you just let it wash over you while you go about your routine.
But is it really effective if you're not paying close attention? I mean, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm thinking about what I need to do, I'm not sitting down with a notebook taking notes.
This is such a common concern, and I want to address it carefully. There are two types of language learning: explicit learning and implicit learning. Explicit learning is what you do when you sit down and study grammar rules or memorize vocabulary lists. Implicit learning is what happens when your brain is absorbing language patterns naturally, without conscious effort, the same way a child learns language. Passive input primarily drives implicit learning, and research consistently shows that implicit learning is incredibly powerful for developing natural fluency.
Can you give me an example of how that actually works?
Of course. Let us say you listen to an English podcast every morning for 30 days while you make breakfast. You are not writing down every word. You are not stopping and looking things up. But your brain is hearing the same kinds of sentence structures over and over. It is hearing natural rhythm, natural intonation, natural pronunciation. It is hearing how phrases connect. And gradually, without you consciously studying any of it, those patterns begin to feel familiar. When you later try to speak or write, those patterns come out more naturally because your brain has heard them hundreds of times.
That is actually what happened to me with a show I watched in English. I watched one show so many times that I started saying some of the phrases naturally in conversation without even realizing I had learned them.
That is a perfect real-world example of implicit learning, and morning passive input is essentially you deliberately creating that kind of exposure every single day. The key is consistency. One day of passive listening will not transform your English, but 30 days, 60 days, 90 days of waking up and immediately immersing yourself in English audio will absolutely change your relationship with the language. Your ear will become trained, understanding will become easier and faster, and your brain will start to feel more comfortable inside the English language.
I love the idea of thinking of it as a warm-up, which you mentioned earlier, like how a runner stretches before they go for a run.
Yes, that is exactly the right metaphor. You would never expect a runner to jump out of bed and immediately sprint at full speed without warming up. The same principle applies to language. Passive input in the morning is your English warm-up. You're gently activating your English language system so that when you need to use it actively later in the day, whether in a meeting, an email, a conversation, the system is already warm and ready.
Okay, so we have the no phone rule, and we have passive input as our morning warm-up. What is the third element to the routine?
The third element is active output, and this is where many learners feel the most nervous, because output means you have to produce English, not just receive it. And producing language feels vulnerable. It requires confidence. But I want to share a technique that is so simple and so low pressure that almost anyone can do it, and it is surprisingly powerful. I call it the I'm doing narration method.
I'm doing narration. Okay, explain that to me because I'm very curious.
Here's how it works. As you go through your morning routine, you narrate what you're doing in English, out loud if you can, or quietly in your head if you feel uncomfortable speaking out loud. You're essentially becoming the narrator of your own life for a few minutes. For example, you wake up and you say, I am waking up, I am turning off my alarm, I am sitting up in bed, I'm walking to the bathroom, I am turning on the tap, the water is cold, I'm waiting for it to get warm, I'm washing my face, the soap smells like lavender.
That sounds almost childlike at first, but I can immediately see how it's actually very advanced when you think about it. You're using present continuous tense, you're describing your sensory experience, you're making observations.
You have identified something really important. The present continuous tense, the I'm doing structure, is one of the most frequently used tenses in everyday spoken English. Native speakers use it constantly to describe what is happening around them. By practicing this tense every single morning in a real, practical context, you're not just reviewing a grammar rule, you're actually internalizing the structure. It becomes automatic.
And you can make it more complex as you get better, right? Like instead of just saying what you're doing, you could describe why or how you feel about it.
Exactly right. When you're a beginner with this technique, you might just say, I'm making coffee. But as you get more comfortable, you push further. I'm making coffee because I did not sleep very well last night. I'm using my favorite mug, the blue one that my sister gave me. The coffee smells strong this morning. I'm thinking about the meeting I have later, and I'm feeling a little nervous about it. Now you've moved into expressing emotions, explaining reasons, using adjectives, and adding personal context. That's real conversation practice happening inside your own home.
I think one of the things that makes this so powerful is that it removes the fear of judgment. You're not in a classroom, no one is grading you. If you make a mistake, nobody heard it. You just correct yourself and keep going.
That is one of the greatest gifts of this method. The fear of making mistakes is one of the most paralyzing forces in language learning. Studies have shown that language anxiety, the fear and embarrassment associated with using a second language, significantly reduces fluency and speaking ability. When you practice speaking in a private, safe space, like your own bathroom or kitchen, you are training your brain to produce English without the panic response. And over time, that confidence transfers to real conversations.
I actually started doing this a few months ago, and I noticed something interesting. I would sometimes stop mid-sentence because I did not know the word for something, and instead of just giving up, I would try to describe it in English. Like I did not know how to say toothbrush holder, so I said the small cup where I put my toothbrush, and my brain started doing that automatically.
That is called circumlocution, and it is one of the most important communication skills a language learner can develop. The ability to describe something when you do not know the exact word is what separates a learner who communicates effectively from one who freezes up every time they hit a vocabulary gap. Native speakers do it all the time. We say, the thing you use to open a bottle, instead of saying bottle opener when the word does not come quickly. Practicing this in your morning narration builds that skill beautifully.
So we have 3 strong habits so far: no phone rule, passive input, and active output through narration. Is there anything else in this morning routine?
Yes, there is one more element that I consider essential, and it is perhaps the simplest one. It is the 5-minute reading habit. And I want to be specific about this because reading in the morning serves a very different function from listening.
How so? I always thought reading and listening were kind of doing the same thing, just through different channels.
That is a reasonable assumption, but they actually activate slightly different cognitive processes. Listening primarily trains your ear, your processing speed, and your ability to understand natural spoken rhythm. Reading, on the other hand, trains your eye for how English is structured on the page. It exposes you to grammar patterns in a more deliberate way. It builds vocabulary in context, and because you control the pace when you read, you can slow down, reread, and actually notice things about the language that might fly past you when you are listening.
So what kind of reading are we talking about? Do I need to pick up a classic novel at 7 in the morning?
Absolutely not. 5 minutes of reading in the morning does not require a novel. In fact, I actively recommend against starting with something too long or too complex. The goal here is not deep literary analysis. The goal is what I call priming the brain with structure. You want to give your brain a short, high-quality example of organized English thought before you start your day. And there are so many accessible sources for this.
Can you give some specific examples? I think our listeners would really benefit from knowing exactly what to look for.
Of course. One excellent option is a short article from a news website that offers simplified English, such as the Learning English sections of major broadcasters. These articles are written in clear, simple sentences with B1 or B2 level vocabulary. Another option is a page from a graded reader, which is a book written specifically for language learners at a particular level. You can also read a short blog post on a topic you find genuinely interesting. The topic matters enormously because if you are bored by what you are reading, your brain disengages and the learning benefit drops significantly.
That is such good advice. I used to force myself to read things that were supposed to be good for my English, but that I found completely boring, and I retained almost nothing.
Because engagement drives retention. When you are genuinely interested in the content, your brain releases dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. And dopamine significantly enhances memory formation. So, when you read something that genuinely fascinates you, whether it's about cooking, technology, sports, travel, or science, your brain is chemically more prepared to remember the vocabulary and structures you encounter. The content of your reading material is not just a preference, it's a learning strategy.
So the 5-minute reading isn't really about the quantity of what you read, it's about the quality of your engagement with it.
Perfectly said. 5 minutes of focused, interested reading is worth far more than 30 minutes of distracted, forced reading. And there is something else I want to mention about why reading is particularly valuable in the morning. When you read a well-written sentence, your brain absorbs the architecture of that sentence. It registers the order of words, the use of punctuation, the way ideas are connected, and this architectural knowledge feeds directly into your own writing and speaking. Learners who read regularly almost always develop better instincts for grammar than learners who only study grammar rules explicitly.
It is almost like your brain is learning the grammar without you having to memorize a rule.
Exactly. That is implicit grammar acquisition through reading, and it is one of the most natural and effective forms of language learning available to us. So our complete morning routine now looks like this. First, you protect your golden hour by following the no phone rule. No social media, no native language noise. Second, you engage in passive input by playing English audio while you go through your morning activities, warming up your language brain. Third, you practice active output through the I am doing narration, building your speaking confidence in a safe, private space. And fourth, you spend 5 minutes reading something in English that genuinely interests you, priming your brain with structure and vocabulary before the day begins.
And all of this realistically adds up to how much time? Because I think some listeners might be hearing this and thinking it sounds like a lot.
That is such an important question, and I'm glad you asked it directly. The honest answer is that this entire routine, done together, adds approximately 0 extra minutes to your day. Let me explain. The no phone rule does not take time, it saves time. The passive input happens while you are already getting ready, so you're not adding time, you're replacing silence or music with English audio. The narration practice happens in your head or out loud during activities you are already doing. And the 5-minute reading can happen while you are having your morning coffee or tea, which you're probably already doing.
So this is a routine that fits inside the life you already have rather than requiring you to build an entirely new schedule around it.
That is the entire philosophy. And this brings us to perhaps the most important concept in this whole conversation, which is the power of consistency over intensity. This is where I want to spend some real time, because I think it is the insight that changes everything for language learners.
Yes, please, because I think this is where most people, including me in the past, get it fundamentally wrong.
Most learners operate on what I call the all-or-nothing model. They study intensely for a week, feel great about their progress, then life gets busy and they stop for 2 weeks, feel guilty, and then try to compensate with another intensive burst. This pattern creates an emotional roller coaster, and it also produces very inconsistent language development. The brain does not learn language well in bursts. It learns language through sustained, repeated exposure over time.
It's like trying to get fit by going to the gym for 6 hours one day and then not going again for a month. The gym session was not wasted, but it definitely didn't build fitness in any sustainable way.
That's a perfect analogy. Physical fitness and language fluency are built the same way, through regular, repeated effort over a long period of time. And here's the scientific principle behind this. Every time you use English, whether you're listening, speaking, or reading, you activate the neural pathways associated with that language. When you activate those pathways regularly, they become stronger. In neuroscience, there's a phrase that describes this beautifully. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more consistently you use English, the more deeply it becomes integrated into your brain's natural functioning.
So 10 minutes every single morning for 6 months is genuinely more effective than studying for 2 hours only on weekends.
For fluency development, absolutely. Research in second language acquisition consistently supports the idea that frequency of exposure matters more than duration of individual sessions. Your brain needs to encounter the language regularly to keep those neural pathways strong and active. When you study only occasionally, the pathways weaken between sessions. But when you engage with English every single morning, even briefly, you maintain a continuous thread of activation. The language stays warm in your brain. It stays accessible.
And I think there's also a psychological element here. When your routine is small and achievable, you actually do it. And when you do it consistently, you start to build an identity around it. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who is trying to learn English, and you start thinking of yourself as someone who uses English every day.
That's a profound insight, Abel, and it connects to research in behavioral psychology. When we build small, consistent habits, we're not just changing our actions, we're changing our self-perception. And self-perception is incredibly powerful in language learning. Learners who see themselves as English users, not just English students, make faster progress because they're more willing to take risks, more willing to make mistakes, and more motivated to seek out English in their daily lives.
It reminds me of something a teacher once told me. She said that fluency is not a destination you arrive at, it's a direction you travel in every day. And every single morning when you wake up and choose to engage in English, you're taking one more step in that direction.
I love that framing, and I want to add something to it. The morning routine we've described today is not just about improving your English, it's about building a relationship with the language, a relationship that is calm, consistent, and integrated into who you are. When English stops being something you have to study and becomes something you naturally live inside, even in small ways every single morning, the progress that follows isn't just linguistic, it's deeply personal.
I think what I find most powerful about everything we've discussed today is that none of it requires a classroom, a teacher, a textbook, or even a lot of money. It requires attention, intention, and the decision to treat every morning as an opportunity.
And that decision, made every morning, compounds over time in a way that is truly remarkable. The learner who does this routine consistently for 1 year will look back and barely recognize the person they were before, not because they studied harder, but because they built a life that was gently, persistently, and beautifully immersed in English from the very first moments of every day.
For anyone listening to this right now, whether you're on your commute, making breakfast, or sitting down for a quiet moment, I hope this conversation has given you something real and practical to take into tomorrow morning, because that's where your fluency begins.
The morning is not just the start of your day. For an English learner with intention and persistence, it's the most powerful classroom you'll ever have, and it's already waiting for you when you open your eyes.